Fantasy Edge podcast brought to you by bettingpredators.com, the BetLife podcast, and Baller X Labs, here to wrap up our Dynasty mega preview for 2026, talking tight end specifically. If you missed out on our YouTube channel and our podcast feed, we did super deep dives on Dynasty wide receivers, Dynasty running backs with Mr. Andres Rojas. You can find him on Twitter and on Patreon. On Twitter is at nofilm_analysis. We're here to talk, again, all things tight ends tonight to wrap up this 3-part series. Andres, if you haven't heard already, is a data analyst for a Fortune 500 company, specializes in the math, in the number, in the data that we really care about. He's your fantasy analyst, favorite data analyst, so to speak. So, Andres, man, really appreciate you coming on again. Welcome back to the show.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. This is the third time now, and so it's really helping me get some experience in the podcasting space and be able to actually articulate some of the things that I've been diving into these prospects. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure. And we're going to do a little screen share here. We're going to dive into Andres's tight end rookie guide. Again, like looking at tight end prospect analysis and overall NFL rookie prospect analysis from strictly like an NFL lens. Like we're talking dynasty here, but Andres is looking at things from an overall player perspective. Doesn't have to necessarily be dynasty related or football related. We're looking into what metrics, what numbers translate into on-field success. Obviously talking a lot of things right now without knowing draft capital, without knowing landing spots, but there's still so many numbers to consider to where we can get a leg up on our competition for when the draft actually comes around here in the next couple of weeks. So, we talked a lot about your modeling strategy and history building this out over the last couple of years. I guess my main question is, on this specific episode, what differs with tight ends and how are you approaching tight end prospect modeling versus what we talked about in previous episodes with running backs and wide receivers?
Yeah, with tight end prospects, what I've found interesting is you notice the most discrepancy with this position than wide receivers, running backs, in terms of like production and on-field value. So with wide receivers and running backs, when they're translating from the NFL, from college to the NFL, a lot of times what it comes down to is how people determine if it's a hit or not is how they're actually producing on the field. With tight ends, you notice a little bit of difference because a lot of people put a lot of emphasis into blocking, and especially with teams, what we've seen is that teams will take a tight end in like the third or fourth round just because of their blocking value. We see that with like Tip Ryman going to the Cardinals or John Bates going to Washington. He played 4 years there, 4 or 5 years, and they actually signed him to a contract extension, but he hasn't really provided them with a lot of receiving production. And obviously we haven't seen that translate to any kind of real fantasy production, but they value him enough just because of what he adds as a blocker. And so with tight ends, what I found interesting is just kind of trying to balance that out with actual on-field receiving production versus how teams are valuing what tight ends are bringing with their blocking.
What have you seen over the last couple of years? Obviously, I'm going to pull up the model here and your tight end guide in a second, but we've had some, outlier years at tight end, and it seems like over the last couple of years, the tight end to college prospect to production on the NFL field has really accelerated, right? It was kind of like Sam Laporta broke the mold of like, hey, normally in Dynasty, you're taking 3-4 years to really become a truly productive and consistent NFL player. Now we see Brock Bowers dominating, obviously, from the last couple seasons as well. What have you seen change over the back testing and historical research that you've done just at this position alone?
Yeah, so it really depends what kind of view you're looking at it through. What I think is happening is that we're really just getting better tight end prospects, especially as receivers. And so if you look at like the last 5-6 years, we see guys like Sam Laporta, Brock Bowers. There's like Colston Loveland, Tyler Warren, obviously McBride with the Cardinals. And a lot of those guys, they were good receivers in college. prior to that, what we really saw was guys like Evan Ingram, who's a little bit on a smaller size for tight ends. You see guys like David Njoku, who was a lot more projection than he was production in college. Guys like OJ Howard. And so with them, they weren't necessarily super productive uh, prospects in college. Evan Ingram came on towards the end, like the latter years of his collegiate career at Ole Miss. But really, in the recent years, we're just seeing an uptick in talent from a receiving perspective. And so I think that's really translated well to the NFL. And I think that's probably the biggest difference in when we're seeing more production with these tight ends coming in their first, second, third year than we saw prior.
What have you seen in terms of what your model is telling you in terms of instant on the field success, right? You mentioned Colston Loveland, Tyler Warren last year, Brock Bowers the year before. Are these players that are popping out and really standing out in your model when you've looked the last couple seasons in your research? And how are you applying it in terms of lessons learned going into 2026?
Yeah, no, I mean, they were all just really good, like clean receiver prospects from the tight end position. And so you look at somebody like Colston Loveland, where his overall just pure volume production wasn't necessarily super impressive. But when you see it relative to like the kind of output, the passing volume output that Michigan was putting out while he was there, it was actually insanely impressive. Looking at his target share, the percentage of passing yards that he was accumulating relative like to other positions. And when you compare that to somebody like Kenyon Sadiq, who I like as like a second round prospect, but his receiving production doesn't necessarily match up to what we saw with Colston Loveland, with Tyler Warren. I mean, with Warren, he had like 3 pretty unproductive years at Penn State. He was behind I'm a Giants fan, so Theo Johnson. And so he was behind Theo Johnson for a couple years, and then he really broke out his senior year, and he had one of the more impressive single receiving seasons at the tight end position. And so we saw a lot of like different flavors, a lot of different pathways to success from these tight end prospects. But with Kenyon Sadiq, a lot of my reservation is that it's still projection, right? We don't necessarily see that kind of production that we saw from these other prospects. And he might have reached that point if he did stay with Oregon for another year or two. He might have reached that kind of ceiling from a production standpoint. But right now, it's just a lot of projection. So his receiving production doesn't really match up to what we see from these other tight end prospects who come to the NFL and start producing right away. Even somebody like Harold Fannin, who had honestly one of the best productive collegiate careers we've seen from a tight end.
I guess that kind of leads into my main question, which I led with on the episode title here, which is it seems like the only 2 real relevant tight ends right now, and you might educate me a little bit later in the show as we dive a little deeper into your top 5, top 10, and overall deep sleepers, but Eli Stowers or Kenyon Sadiq, it seems like the majority of the public is on Sadiq just due to the measurables. He's going to be drafted higher. Do you think Stowers catches up in draft capital? And I guess just give me your take on Sadiq versus Stowers, continuing kind of what you just mentioned a few seconds ago on Sadiq in terms of his athletic prowess, but maybe not the best on-field production, route running, hands, etc.
Yeah. So when we're talking about athleticism, especially comparing Stowers to Sadiq, it's honestly just a push, right? I think they're both like top 5 in terms of athletic testing from the tight end position. And what we actually see from a lot of tight ends, this is a super, super athletic class. And so that's why I'm not going to necessarily reference athleticism that much in terms of separating a prospect from another. The thing with Stowers is, as I mentioned before, so with Sadiq, a lot of it is just projection, right? We didn't necessarily, he never had like a super impressive single season from a receiving standpoint at Oregon. But he's going into the NFL draft as one of the younger prospects in the entire draft. He's going to be 21 years old for the entirety of his rookie season. Compare that to somebody like Stowers, who does have a much more impressive receiving output in his college career at Vanderbilt. But he's going to be coming into the NFL as a 23-year-old, and so that's where it's really hard to kind of balance out what we value from a tight end prospect. But looking at Stowers, he is one of the strongest. He's probably the strongest receiving prospect in this year's draft, and he compares pretty well to historically to other receiving prospects coming into the NFL draft. Obviously he tested like out of this world at the NFL Combine. But with Stowers, I think you probably see the biggest discrepancy in how a lot of film analysts will value tight end prospects versus like maybe the fantasy or dynasty community, because Stowers has like that receiving production. But like the truth is, he's not going to be a very good blocker, right?
Right.
Especially in line. The way I see blocking for tight ends is like 90, like maybe 80 to 90% of prospects, they have the potential to be a good enough blocker, right? And so with Stowers, he's going to have that potential to be a decent blocker, especially like from a moving alignment. But if he's going to hit, it's going to be because of his receiving prowess. We look at somebody like Darren Waller, who, if you look at it, if you remove his receiving value, he's one of the worst blocking tight ends in the NFL.
Right.
At a time with New England, at a time with the Raiders, at a time with the Giants, at a time with the Dolphins. They will use him from like the inline alignment, maybe like 55% of the time. But when they do call on him to block, he's just not very effective. And so, but like teams are still willing to invest into that just because of what he adds as a receiver. And so if Stowers is going to hit an NFL and if he's going to reach his ceiling, it's going to be more with what we've seen with Darren Waller. Versus with Sadiq, what we see is that he does have more potential as a blocker. He's a better inline blocker, but still he's not like necessarily great inline blocker, especially just because of his size and the power he has when he's on the field. But he's actually a pretty good move blocker, which I do like from him. Like the difference between Sadiq as a blocker and Stowers is bigger than Stowers and Sadiq as receivers. So that's why, it's really going to be a flavor thing where what people like. There's going to be more potential that people see with Sadiq. He's more compact. So that's really what I'm seeing from the top two prospects.
So right now, NFL Tankathon's mock draft, which they update daily, has Kenyon Sadiq going 19th overall. Eli Stowers, clear second tight end, but 45th overall, middle of the second round. And then if you scroll down a little bit more, I think you got to go all the way to the end of the third or maybe even fourth round for the next tight end to go off the board, Justin Jolly at 111. And we'll talk a little bit more about those guys, but just sticking on Sadiq for a second, if obviously that holds, like I'm seeing on playerprofiler.com, all the different 40-yard dash, speed score, burst score, cat score. If you look at Stowers and Sadiq, you're going to see 97 percentile or higher for both. Sadiq is essentially number one in his class at every one of these metrics, right? I think the only one is 99 percentile catch radius and everything else 100th percent. So super freak athlete, 6'3", 241 pounds out of Oregon, as you mentioned. But, like college yards per route run, 23rd, college dominator rating 70th, breakout age 64th. So it's really just the raw athletic traits that Sadiq is bringing to the table here. I see the best comparable player here. The player comp for Player Profiler has Vernon Davis, which kind of makes sense on the surface. Like, do you see that type of potential, or is there any other players that you've studied in your model over the last couple of years, specifically not as far back as Davis, that kind of remind you of that maybe Kenyon Sadiq light-ish type of role?
Yeah, I think that is a decent comparison, especially if you're going to look from the high end. What I see in Sadiq is like a younger Evan Ingram. So back when Evan Ingram was coming out as a prospect, I mean, so I'm a Giants fan, so we took him in the first round. He came in as a 23-year-old. And if you look at like age adjusted production from Ingram to Sadiq, they're actually pretty comparable. And so what I see from Sadiq is like, okay, what happened if Evan Ingram came out 2 years earlier as a 21-year-old? Ingram went on to have his best years at Ole Miss in his age 22 and age 23 season. And so we haven't necessarily seen that from Sadiq yet. And so it's really just projection. And then my concern again is like, okay, let's say we assume he goes on and has that kind of production if he stayed at Oregon, but it's still a hypothetical. And Ingram, I mean, he's been a good like receiving tight end in the NFL, but I'm not sure how many teams are going to necessarily value that as a first rounder. And so when we look at Sadiq, I kind of view that through the same lens where if he's going to hit, maybe he comes in and becomes better in the Ingram. He's younger. Maybe a team can mold him to be like a better tight end. But again, it's still just projection. And that's what kind of separates me from teams viewing him as like a first round prospect. For me, I mean, he can come in and he can provide that kind of value, but it's still a risk. And so if I'm going to take a chance on that, I would prefer to take a chance on that in like the second round rather than right now he's being ranked as like a mid first round prospect in this year's draft.
Right. And even looking at Ingram's profile from a few years back, best comp at the time, Gerald Everett. But you look at those measurables again, the workout metrics 100th percentile, best 40-yard dash in his class, 97th percentile speed score, everything borderline 90th percentile or above, catch radius, burst score, agility score, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we had that hype around an Evan Ingram. It seems like Sadiq maybe is a little more athletic because people forget how athletic Evan Ingram was considered coming into the
Yeah,
league.
I mean,
So,
it's depends how you like. I think Ingram was probably faster on the field than Sadiq, but I
right.
would give the edge to Sadiq in terms of power and explosiveness. But like, even if you give him that edge relative to Ingram, he's stronger and he's more explosive. But then relative to other tight ends, he still falls short, and so that's kind of how I view it.
Yeah. So let's like before we kind of get your full take on Stowers, I know you kind of teased it a little bit. The comparisons over the last couple of years, we had Bowers, he was the clear number one tight end prospect. We had Warren and Loveland, that was a genuine debate. I think obviously Loveland is winning that side of the debate right now.
If you want, you can
Uh,
scroll to like the towards the bottom, and I actually provided my top 16 prospects in the class in my model, like towards the end. You can
okay.
see how those tight ends stack up historically.
Okay, gotcha. All right, so let's
So
okay,
I
here we
also
go.
gave like
Yeah,
four profiles, but like if you scroll up above Brock, yeah, you can see
right
the
here.
top ones
Okay,
there.
there we go. Awesome. So Kyle Pitts, TJ Hawkinson, Dalton Kincaid, Warren Kraft, which I really like a lot. I thought he was really underrated
Yeah,
coming out. Loveland, Mark Andrews, Noah Fan, obviously super athletic freak. And then Michael Mayer, who's been buried behind Bowers since. So,
yeah,
yeah, no, that's interesting that you have, you still have Trey McBride, you still have Laporta, Harold Fannin, and then you have Stowers, and then you have Sadiq, and then Gadsden. Oh, it's kind of similar prospect in a sense
hmm
athletically, right? So when we see Stowers and Sadiq here, 7.48 prospect score, 7.43, it's almost a coin flip, like you said, right? Like what are you looking at most between the different metrics on this model: production grade, efficiency grade, film grade, yards after the catch grade, deep threat grade? Um, what do you think's most important when it comes to the tight end position when you're on, let's say you're on the clock in a dynasty draft and it's Sadiq or Sowers? Like, which way are you going and which numbers are you using to kind of give yourself some more confidence in making that pick between those two guys?
yeah. So from like a dynasty perspective, I mean, you can see their grades, right? They're pretty much even. They're as equal as grades you can get, which is very very interesting because they're probably the difference between them is 0.5, and the difference between like Colston Loveland and Warren last year was also like very close. And so I find that pretty interesting. And in last year, how I viewed it was also essentially a coin flip. Like if you give me 4 teams in Dynasty and I have the chance to draft Loveland or Warren last year, I was just gonna split it right down the middle, and that's probably how I view
Mhm.
Stowers and Sadiq also. And so, like with Stowers, I think he has a higher floor as a receiver. Sadiq, I think he has a higher ceiling. But really, what that comes down to is like, okay, if Sowers is on the field and the team trusts him as a receiver, he's gonna produce. But it could become a problem as far as getting onto the field. Like, I mean, his comp in here is Mike Gesicki, who I think is probably a good comp because I think Gesicki is pretty good receiver. He's like also uber athletic,
Right.
but I think what's been holding him back is his ability as a blocker, especially from the inline alignment. And so that's kind of how I view Stowers. And so it really depends how you view it. Like, so Stowers, I think, has a higher floor as a receiver, but then Sadiq probably has a higher floor as a prospect because he's probably going to go in the first round. Teams are going to give him more opportunities than Stowers is probably guaranteed. And so that's really how I view that.
How are you? And when I mentioned the mock draft earlier, and this is a guy we'll get into in about a minute here, but Max Clare is actually the third
Yeah,
tight
I
end to
like that.
projected
I
off
like
the
that.
board as a third round pick,
Yeah.
and then you've got Justin Jolly as a fourth round pick. So it's almost like we've almost got like a staple tight end for each round of the draft through the first 4 rounds as those top four here. And I'll pull things back up to the top of your rankings as we'll go through that. When it comes to landing spot, like you kind of mentioned this as well, and I feel like this might matter the most for tight ends and first year dynasty rookie production of like frankly what team are these guys going to land on that features the tight end, right? That schemes the tight end looks, especially for a guy like Stowers, who in that Mike Gesicki role, I think we've seen Gesicki get buried on depth charts in the past where they need more blocking than normal, right? Like so is it going to be a team that runs primarily 12 personnel, two tight end sets? Um, how are you factoring? Does that change at all in terms of landing spot or draft capital more important versus the running backs and wide receivers we've broken down in the past?
It might, like with landing spot. I'm always gonna say maybe because if we go back to Evan Ingram, right, and he was drafted by the Giants in 2017, and so if we've now seen him for probably so like 8 seasons, and if we were to go down the hypothetical path, or do we think Ingram is going to have a better career if he was drafted somewhere other than the Giants? We've seen how he produced with Denver. We've seen how he produced with Jacksonville, and so I mean, he had a good season with the Giants. He had a good season with Jacksonville. He's been kind of up and down with Denver. And so the way I see that is like it might matter, maybe for the first season or two. But if we're looking at it holistically from the career, I think it all kind of evens out. There's a couple landing spots where I do think where I am going to give them a boost. I'm thinking guys like Denver, I think would be a really good spot. I mean, the 49ers, teams like that, who I think really value um, uh, Los Angeles, I think, is a really, really interesting spot. But I mean, I like Gaston there, and
Yeah.
so it's going to be interesting to see if they take a tight end. But I really like what like bringing in Mike McDaniel's, and so and like if he was still with Miami, Miami would have been a really, really interesting spot for a tight end because they don't really have anybody. But now he's with LA, so I think they are really, really intriguing spot. But beyond that, I mean, we saw what Harold Fannin did with Cleveland last year, right? They're like
Right.
on paper not a great landing spot, but I had really, really high confidence in Fannin as a receiver, especially if he went to a team that really believed in him. And so he went to Cleveland, not an ideal landing spot, but he had a phenomenal year for them. And so, in terms of landing spot, outside of where I see like there's a lot of upside potential with teams like Denver or San Francisco or LA, the Chargers. I don't necessarily see that much of a difference in the other landing spots.
Do you say, so you have Stowers, like the high end comp of Darren Waller, low end comp Irv Smith, yet you've got Stowers one spot behind Fannin, another spot behind
Yeah.
McBride, and
Hmm.
like those two guys have obviously popped off a ton. Like I've got McBride. I picked McBride off the waiver wire in my hybrid dynasty keeper league. I think when he was in his second year, and he really wasn't producing that much. I'm
Yeah.
my mind's blanking on who he was stuck behind in the depth
Zach
chart.
Ertz.
That's there you go.
Yeah.
So, but it's like now you see he is like the bona fide, top one or top two or three at the worst. And
Hmm.
Fannin, we're already seeing that potential of the elite pass catching ability and the elite ability to earn targets at such a young age. Do you? I'm obviously the Stowers fits the mold more compared to those guys. They're not the most athletic in the world, right? Um,
Yeah.
like, do you see potential there, right landing spot for Stowers to become what Trey McBride and Harold Fannin have been in terms of just guys who get extreme volume in targets and can really operate and dominate targets in those short to intermediate areas of the field?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see him hitting the upside of like someone like McBride. I mean, McBride is essentially hitting like the top 1% all time in terms of receiving production for a tight end, and he was like super productive in college. Also, the thing that kind of held him back in the model was that he was taken in the second round. The school he went to was not necessarily a prestigious school in terms of pumping out prospects, the level of competition. But like in college, he was super productive, even more so than anything we've seen with Sowers. Same goes to Harold Fannin, right? He's graded above Sowers and Sadiq, despite that lower draft capital, despite the level of competition at Bowling Green. But he was just such a dynamic receiver, like an historic outlier in Bowling Green that I kind of made up for that.
Right.
With Stowers, I don't see that kind of upside. Like even with Fannin, where I just have so much confidence in what he can do in a short to intermediate game and his ability to make people miss. If Sowers comes in and becomes productive, he's going to do it more so in that Darren Waller role where he's more so like a intermediate target. But and so and I mean he was targeted on like 27% of his routes, and we see that is ranking in the 97th percentile of tight end prospects since 2019. So obviously he has that receiving upside, but I don't think he necessarily has what we've seen with McBride, especially because of his size. Like we don't I don't know if we've historically ever seen a sub 240 tight end come in and produce like 900 or 1,000 yards in the NFL. Like I guess maybe Ingram got close. He's like sub 230, but he did off like 120 receptions.
Sure. Yeah. Maybe Stowers,
Yeah.
Kansas City, maybe potential Travis Kelsey replacement in the future. I don't know. I'm just
Yeah.
thinking
I
about
like
possible
another
landing space
prospect
there.
for Kansas City that we can maybe go into later.
All right, yeah, we'll definitely do that. So, all right, so I think that's enough on the Stowers and Sadiq debate. If push comes to shove, you're on the clock, Andres Rojas, in your dynasty league. You can take Stowers or Sadiq. Is it just Sadiq because of the full round draft capital edge, or do you have a strong
Probably.
stance either way?
Yeah, like if push comes to shove and I have to choose one of them, I'm probably gonna leave Sadiq. But like if we're looking at it from dynasty perspective, what I would do is like, okay, I'll take Sadiq and then I would offer him for Sowers and pretty much anything else, a low third or something like
Yeah,
that, just because I have him right there and Sadiq is valued higher in consensus.
yeah,
That I'm always gonna, if I have guys that close in the ranking, but the discrepancy in the consensus, I'm always gonna just try to trade them for just a little bit more. But if I had to choose a player and had to keep them, I'm probably leaning Sadiq.
yeah. I would say yes in terms of like if you had to make a pick between those two, because it's the ADP, it's the actual dynasty draft capital of like you're gonna need to take Sadiq earlier than Stowers, right? So
Yeah,
I would
exactly.
I would personally prefer Stowers because you're probably gonna get him a round or two later in a dynasty draft, but like you said, these are guys that are very equal. They're a little bit different. Stowers more of a naturally gifted pass catcher, Sadiq more of a naturally gifted athlete. But when you look at across the board, as you see here, uh, Sadiq maybe a little more efficient in terms of his efficiency score, yards after the catch score,
Yeah.
checklist score almost exactly the same, even because Sadiq scoring a little higher in the film score as well, where you see the real edge for Stowers just being in pure production, right? Like that's where you see
Yeah.
the biggest edge between those two guys, and also as a deep threat as well. So it's interesting to see the back and forth and the debates we'll have
Mhm.
really from now leading up to week 1 of the NFL season as drafts continue, even into redraft season. Well, let's talk about the next guy on your list. I brought him up here. I'll pull him up on your prospect guide as well. Is Max Clare, right? And like this is a guy where you're none of the numbers we talked about with combine metrics are going to jump out on the page with you with him. 6'4", 246 pounds out of Ohio State. Nothing screaming super athlete here. But when you look at the data that you're bringing into your model, he actually scores closer to Sadiq and Stowers
Mhm.
than once you get outside the top 5. So he's kind of right there as like a clear, strong third prospect. Obviously, right now projected middle third round pick according to Tankathon's latest mock draft. What are you seeing from Max Clare that you like? That you think is what's pushing him closer
Yeah.
to that top tier compared to the guys behind him?
No, I think Claire is a lot closer to Sadiq and Stowers than he's getting credit for.
Okay.
He's really in his own tier as that tight end 3. And so in the grading, one of the things that we have to account for is like their projected draft capital. And so Stowers has second round projected draft capital, which pushes him up to that first tight end ranking. Sadiq has that first round draft capital, and then Max Clare has that third round draft capital. But if the draft comes around and Claire is taken in the second round, and say Stowers is taken in the second round and Sadiq is taken in the first round, he actually, I haven't tested it, but I think there's a good chance that he actually moves up to that tight end 1 spot with that draft capital. Just
Oh wow.
because with Claire, what I really like about him is I also think he has one of the highest floors in the class. I think his floor is right up there with Stowers and Sadiq. I think he's a lot more balanced as a tight end prospect. He's a lot more traditional than as what we've seen. Has a really well-rounded profile. There's that he definitely has like a cap ceiling that for different reasons that he doesn't that Stowers and Sadiq has above him. But beyond that, I still really like him. I think he has what I think is maybe the most impressive season from a tight end in this class, even including someone like Stowers, and that's his 2024 season at Purdue. I really liked what he did in that role. But then he comes to Ohio State. He plays alongside Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate. I mean, obviously they're both seen as like top 10, top 5 projected wide receivers, and so his production and efficiency took a dip with Ohio State. But regardless, I still value and weigh his 2024 season really high just because we've seen that kind of ceiling that he has. He reminds me a lot of like what we've seen with Mark Andrews in Baltimore. So his run blocking is like what I've mentioned, right? It falls in that 80 to 90% of tight end prospects where if he goes to a coach, I think he has the potential to be a good enough blocker, especially to stay on the field. But as a receiver, like if he does hit his ceiling, it's going to be what we've seen with like Mark Andrews. I don't think he necessarily has that kind of consistency, but it's going to be in that kind of role versus someone like Sadiq or Sowers is more comparable to like that Isaiah Likely role.
Right. I see you had the high end player comp Pat Fryermuth, but you're not going to go as far
Yeah,
as say.
I think that's probably more mid tier. I think that's probably cutting it short a little bit, but I do see them comparable as prospects. Because I also like Pat Fryermuth coming out, and I saw that kind of potential
Yeah.
for him also, but he may have like a little bit of higher ceiling.
Right, and ready to come in and produce from day one. Look at what he did at, like you said, at Purdue 2 years ago. Even a solid season at Ohio State last season, even though the numbers dipped a little bit increase in just overall talent pool at Ohio State compared to Purdue. So would you say you're saying comfortably that you think that a high end comp would be Mark Andrews and more of a
Yeah,
middle comp for Freiermuth?
maybe. So I say with him coming in, he's like 70% of Mark Andrews. So how do we
Okay.
value 70% of Mark Andrews? If he reaches that high end, it's going to be like 90% of Andrews. With Andrews, when he came out, he played with Baker at Oklahoma. I mean, he was someone else that I think we saw he ranked pretty high in my productive model. Like with Mark Andrews, it's like, okay, if we saw what Max Clare did at Purdue times three, like 3 seasons of that is kind of
Right.
what we saw from Mark Andrews. So that's why he's probably, I don't necessarily see him reaching that upside, but it's like 80-90% of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And just again, like mock drafts are all over the place. And, you know, we're doing a lot with the fantasy edge of tracking mock drafters in terms of historical accuracy, using it to find an edge in betting NFL draft props, and that's something that we're going to be announcing in the next coming week. But when I look at the landing spot specifically, just going back to take-a-thon for the sake of this episode, Kenyon Sadiq right now, as I mentioned in the first round, going to Carolina. Second round, Eli Stowers going to Baltimore. So you mentioned the Mark Andrews comp in terms of Max Clare, but I would think Mark Andrews with that new contract would be splitting snaps with Eli Stowers. But then you see Max Clare going to KC, 74th overall.
That would be good.
That would be, like you said, that would be a great landing spot. They're looking for someone to take over the Kelsey role. They run 12 personnel. They're not really too excited. The usage we saw with Noah Gray kind of tampered down a little bit after there was some excitement 2 seasons ago with him. So I think that that's a perfect guy where all of a sudden you're splitting snaps with Kelsey. Kelsey goes down with an injury. Kelsey retires after the season. And, you've got the best tight end option from this class in terms of long-term dynasty value in a guy like Max Clare. And that's something that definitely excites me a lot. And I said how I like Stowers over Sadiq just in terms of dynasty ADP. Well, I think you could say the same thing about Max Clare here, just looking at your numbers and like, hey, not only, hey, I can get Stowers in round 2 or 3 of my rookie draft. Well, I can get Max Clare in round 5 or 6 of my rookie draft. And that upside is still there because like the pass catching prowess, we're not really too concerned about being 100th percentile tight end prospect coming into the league either. And that kind of bleeds into the overall rankings that you have, because the one guy I've seen a lot of hype in, and he's kind of been in that top 4 conversation, and we'll skip over to him for now, but it's Justin Jolly. And, another guy who really jumps out at the page athletically. I'll pull up the comp and go side by side for your model and what Player Profiler has for him. 6'4", 241 pounds, similar size out of NC State. 98th percentile breakout age, right? So like he's doing it at a very, very young age compared to these other guys. What do you think your model necessarily, why do you think it's holding Jolly back in terms of the overall prospect grades from going from Max Clare to 3 all the way down to Jolly at 7? He's close to the guys ahead of him, but still kind of in that like clear, like 3rd or 4th tier here. What are your thoughts on Jolly and what is the model telling you about him?
Yeah. So with Jolly, what I see with him coming out as a prospect, he's like, so we talked about Claire being like 70% of Mark Andrews, and how do we value that? Jolly is like 70-80% of Harold Fannin, right? And so, how do we value that? Fannin went at the top of the 3rd round to the Browns, but I thought he was like a fringe, I wouldn't say 1st round pick, but maybe like a mid 2nd round pick. I was really high on Harold Fannin, and with Jolly, he's like 70% of that. And then it's like, okay, so how do we value that? He's a decent blocker. Inline blocking is not that great, but he could have some value as like a move blocker. Compare him to like Daquan Wright, who I think is maybe a better receiver, but I think he's like an outright just bad blocker, right? Jolly, I think he has some potential as like a move blocker, not necessarily as much as like an inline blocker. But he was productive, right? I like when we see production kind of spread across multiple seasons. And so we saw that with Jolly. And so, and what I really like, I don't know if you knew this, so he's at NC State, and in 2024, he played alongside KC Concepcion. And so I've done a lot of digging into Justin Jolly related because of some work I've done with looking into Concepcion. And so they both played at NC State. And you see a lot of people talking about Concepcion's bad QE play. Okay, well, Jolly had 200 more yards than Concepcion on the same team, running the same amount of routes. His QBR when targeted was 50 points higher than what Concepcion was in that same season. And so obviously there's something there with Jolly where he has potential as a receiver. And I really like what I like in tight ends is like, how are they in traffic? And so we see that Justin Jolly has a 66% catch rate in traffic. His ball skills overall are pretty good. His drop rate is hovering around 5%. I think his route running can use some refinement. I like a lot what Justin Jolly offers as a receiver, but as a pure route runner, I don't think he's necessarily as good as some other guys. I like him in spades as far as like, I think he's going to make the first guy miss. I'd like him in isolation, making people miss. But he's not going to run around he's not going to run past any guys. I don't think he ran a 40, but if I had to guess, it's probably hovering around like 4.7. So as yak ability, he's not going to be able to run past guys like we see with Stowers or Sadiq. But he has some potential after the catch, just like making people miss.
Production score higher than Stowers, higher than Sadiq. We'll talk about the guy who's highest on the list overall, but how do you view the production score and also the breakout age, right? Of him doing this at a very young age and him kind of having that runway heading into the league of like, hey, I've strung together now, 3 seasons of borderline 40 plus receptions, 400 plus receiving yards. And obviously the touchdowns had a career high 7 last year, 4 the year before. How do you weigh that at the tight end position specifically? I know we talk a lot about breakout age for wide receivers. How are you viewing that with tight ends coming into the league?
Yeah, his production profile is interesting. If you compare his to somebody with a completely different archetype, but in the end they end up with like similar yardage as someone like Tyler Warren, who he had about 1,800 yards at Penn State, but like 1,300 of that, right, came in his final senior season. With Jolly, he's putting up almost 2,000 yards in his 4-year career, but it's pretty evenly spread out, especially his sophomore season, which is his breakout season, and so then over the last 3 years, he's hovering around 500-600 yards over the last 3 seasons. So he has that consistency, which gives me like some confidence in his floor as a receiver coming in. But I have some concerns as far as like his ceiling as a receiver.
Okay. How far are you willing to go down on this list? Because there's one guy I see that you've got buried on here. That is no. Well, it's a guy. So I'm going now off the Tankathon big board rankings, and it's Sadiq, Stowers, Claire, Jolly. Okay, I think that's more or less consensus I've seen at a lot of places. So I think you're not saying you're out on Jolly. You're just saying you don't have him as a clear fourth, which totally get that. He's more in that kind of bundled tier between Endries, Gillenborg, Daquan Wright, Jolly, right? Even a couple guys before them, pretty close. Koziel, Bentley, Rohan Jones, etc. But the next guy I'm seeing on Tankathon's list, and I feel like all the prospects this season, it's like the same size, like same height, same weight, except for Sam Roush from Stanford, 6'6", 267 pounds. Tankathon has him 1 spot above Michael Trigg, 2 spots above Oscar Delp, 2 spots below Justin Jolly. So in that tier, but it seems like you're much lower on him as a prospect at 19th overall. Do you have any thoughts on him? Like, it sounds like he might be a bit overrated here compared to the other guys we're talking about.
Yeah, with Roush, there's certain guys, especially when they're higher in consensus and how I view him, that what I really want is like, okay, what are other people seeing in him, right? And I'm like, I've been following along to some of like what people say about Sam Roush. I don't know if it's Roush or Rouge. And what I'm seeing is like, okay, he may be like a mid-tier blocker, right? But he still falls in that 80% range where like I think most tight ends can be coached up to be a decent enough blocker. With Roush, he has the size and he's probably maybe a top 5 blocker from like the inline alignment. And so but then when we're talking about like translatability to the NFL, he's not a good enough blocker that I have confidence that he's going to come in and be a plus blocker for a team. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing is like, okay, does he have potential as a blocker? Maybe if he lands on the same team, on the right team and he gets coached up, maybe. But he's not like some of the blockers that we've seen come in like John Bates, who I think was a really good blocker coming out of college. He's not like that level, right? So I don't really see the potential in him being a good blocker. And then we look at the receiving production, and I'm just not seeing it, right? So like he played for Stanford, and so he had plenty of opportunity. He's running the routes for them. He's getting the targets, but whether it's receiver or tight end, one of the things I really like to see, especially when translating into the NFL, is like, how are you as a target compared to your peers, right? Or is your quarterbacks producing at a higher level when you're being targeted versus your peers? And it's Roush is coming in with one of the lowest QB ratings when targeted of any prospect, right? It's sub 80 QB rating when targeted. Mm-hmm. And in college, he has a TD interception ratio of like 4-7, right? And he's not converting in traffic. He's a sub 50% success rate in traffic. He drops the ball all the time.
I was just gonna say that he's really low drop.
I'm just like, there's when I look at people like him, I'm like, okay, I look at his profile and I'll do some digging. And I'm like, there's nothing there. And a lot of times when I do my analysis, it's really like in isolation, separate from consensus. I'm like digging into these guys and not really see what people are saying about them. And then I'll see like people bring up somebody like Sam Roush and they'll like start hyping him up as like a top 5 prospect. And I'm like just completely blown away. I'm just not seeing what people are seeing in this guy. And so that feels like I'm kind of going in on him, but that's how I feel.
No, that's fair. I kind of wanted to bring up that discrepancy there and kind of go full circle. Overall, I brought up that tier. Is there anyone that jumps out at you that maybe you disagree with the model a little bit, that you think could be undervalued in terms of the tier 3, right? Well, we have tier 1, Stowers Sadiq. We have borderline tier 2, Max Clare. And then we've got the next group of guys, Endries, Gillenborg. I'm probably butchering all these names. Daquan Wright. We mentioned Justin Jolly, Koziel, Dallin Bentley, Rohan Jones, even Michael Trigg. That's the top 11 right there. Who do you think that you've got your eye on most in terms of who can maybe exceed expectations based off coming into to the league, what the prospect grade is showing?
So Jack Endries is a prospect that I've been following him since really, really early in the process. So back in like January, he was like a top 70 prospect. And so he comes in and he tests honestly better than I was expecting. When I was like watching him and looking into him, I thought he was going to be like maybe a slightly above average athlete. And he tested better than I thought. And so that is another plus for him. But what I really like about Endries, so he played at Texas in 2025. He played with Arch Manning in 2024. He played at Cal, and his QB was Fernando Mendoza. And so he's playing with potentially he played with potentially the top first overall picks in the 2026, and I mean, say Arch Manning goes first overall in 2027. So those were his QBs in college, and he really produced with Mendoza. I really liked what I saw for him in 2024, and then he came in 2025 with Arch Manning in Texas, and honestly, his first couple of games, I thought he was going to play his way into like maybe the tight end one as a prospect. He had like I think 200 yards, a couple touchdowns his first two games, and then it just took like a major. His production took a major dip after that, like towards the midseason, and then he comes back and actually has a pretty good end of season in 2025. And so with Andrews, he's again somebody that I really like. I think he's another really high floor prospect. And what I like about him is that he fits that traditional mold for tight end prospect, right? He's 6'5", he has the size, he plays in line, he plays from the slot. I like him as an inline blocker more than a lot of guys, especially like I think he has the potential again to be coached up to be a good blocker, but I think he's shown more as an inline blocker than most of these guys. He has athleticism to become in and be also a move blocker, and so I have his high end comp as Sam Laporta, but
Yeah,
him and like Max Clare are like two guys who I think their archetype are very similar to each other, and
right.
so with injuries, but then now he dropped in the consensus board, and he just reminds me of one of those prospects that we see like every year, like a handful of guys who are good prospects, high floor, but then like once draft season comes around, everything just kind of passes them by as far as like who people are looking at. Once one person starts talking about one prospect, then like they catch on, and injuries just seems like for whatever reason this draft season just kind of passed him by. But I think if more people like watched him and if there was more hype around him, more people are going to like him. But for whatever
Yeah.
reason, people aren't talking about him.
No, I mean it's fair. I think the market is just completely uncertain. Like no one knows once you get past Sadiq, Sowers, and Claire because you've got again using the Tankathon big board, Justin Jolly 111 overall, and then you go all the way down. You got to go seven more tight ends deep, and you're still at 165th. You know, about 50 spots between, and that's about 10 tight ends, all within that range, right?
Mhm.
And then even going all the way down to 185 with Michigan tight end Marlon Klein, that's everyone that we've got listed. So that's a lot of tight ends grouped between, prospect number 100 ish to prospect number 199,
Yeah.
200th, right? And like, how can we dig up value and actionable edges based on who to take in this ranges of the last round of your rookie draft, super deep keeper leagues, super deep dynasty leagues, best ball drafts, etc. I definitely like in terms of if Jack Andrews gets a good landing spot of him being a potential sleeper there as well. Just kind of taking it back to your overall list, the one guy I did want to ask you about specifically is a guy you have in the top 8, one spot behind Jolly, but I think Tanner Koziel is how you say his name,
Mhm.
from Houston, because the thing that jumps out to me is he's still in this kind of bundled tier here in your tight end model, but the production score really pops off. 7.46 looks like by far the highest out of your top 30 tight ends in this draft. And a good athletic score to boot on top of that. So when you look at elite production, elite athleticism, what are your thoughts on Tanner Koziel being a potential sleeper, overvalued, undervalued, etc.?
Yeah, so he has the production, he has the size. He's like 6'6". He reminds me. So going back to like how we value certain players. So Mike Gesicki, he's been a decent receiving prospect. If you're a Bengals fan, so you're probably familiar with
That's
Gesicki.
right.
So
Bengals fan in Pittsburgh. Let's go.
Tanner, he's like, okay, how do we value 70% of Mike Gesicki? Right. So
Okay.
he has like receiving upside. He's had some productive years, but a lot of it is just like not the kind of production that I necessarily hold at a high value. He's ran a lot of routes, right? He's ran over 300 yards 300 routes each of the last 4 years. And so he's had a lot of playing time. And so he just reminds me of, like, if you think to the NFL, where every season we see these tight end prospects that are kind of like productive out of nowhere just because they're just getting that kind of volume. Tanner kind of reminds me of that in college. And so I don't necessarily see a lot of upside with him. And from that perspective, as a blocker, I mean, so he has the size. He's going to be more of an inline blocker. But most of his career, he played like outside of the slot. So with his size and scheme, kind of, I'm not sure exactly how teams are going to value him. And also, when I've looked historically, he just fits the kind of profile of just a lot of tight ends that have like productive years in college, but don't necessarily do anything in the NFL just because they're kind of role agnostic and teams are unsure of what to get out of them. So with him, I don't necessarily see that kind of upside, and I'm not even sure teams are going to invest the kind of draft capital in him that would even make him intriguing.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic too, because you look at the elite production score of what he did at Houston specifically, and a lot of these things can be, there could be misconceptions for him because the offense could have been designed around him. The scheme, obviously, playing for a smaller school in Houston compared to other major Power Five teams as well. And then you look at the yards per reception, ranks pretty low. Yards after the catch per reception ranks pretty low. So it's like you would think a guy who's as productive on paper as Koziel is would rank better in those metrics. But that's another reason of, like you said, like what reasons does the coaching staff have to not put him on the field? And draft capital is obviously the major concern with a guy like him in this tier, but then the lack of explosiveness, right, at the same time. I think it'd play into that to definitely hold him back, even though he's kind of a sexy name on paper with the 6'7" height, with the production score, with the athletic score, and everything like that. Just want to pull it back. We'll touch on one or two other guys. We don't want to get too deep in the weeds here, but when you look at your overall rankings for this class, I'll bring up some names like we talked about Sam Roush already, Michael Trigg, Oscar Delp, Eli Raridon, Dallin Bentley, Joe Royer, John Michael Gillenborg, who probably has the coolest name in the entire draft for tight end. Sounds like a Terminator character.
He also has the coolest picture of anyone in.
Is that right?
I just posted about him yesterday.
I was going to say I like Sam Roush had like the tape between the glasses kind of look there.
Yeah.
So we got Gillenborg there. Nate Borkature. I think if I'm saying half of these names right, I'm doing a pretty good job for where we're at in the process here. But do you want to talk Gillenborg? Do you any of these other names pop out at you?
Gillenborg is somebody else that really interests me. I think so. I posted yesterday, and what I said was that there's like a George Kittle-esque prospect that has receiving upside that nobody is talking about. And I've seen Kittle's name thrown around a couple times. I saw him connected to Oscar Delp, which, I mean, to touch on Oscar Delp a couple times, I think one, he's had plenty of playing time. He's never had a season above 300 receiving yards. We're talking about Oscar Delp. Mm-hmm. But what really scares me is he has like a 16% contested catch rate. And I'm just like, from the tight end position, and you're catching 70% of your contested targets, you're not uber productive. Delp is just somebody that I don't necessarily see any upside in. With Gillenborg, what I really like about him is he might be the most athletic tight end in the class, right? He stands at 6'6", he's about 250 pounds, and he doesn't have the speed of somebody like Sowers or Sadiq. He doesn't have that 4.4 speed. He ran, I think, like a 4.6 40, which at his size is a pretty good 40 for the tight end. And what I like about him that's kind of separates him in this class is that he's like one of the few genuine vertical threats at the tight end position. And we see that with his athletic profile, and we see that with his production, that he has the ability to stretch defenses. And what I really like about him is that he didn't play college football He didn't play football until his senior year in high school. And then, so he's kind of this raw prospect, but he still has this dynamism. He still has this explosiveness, just from like a raw skill set. And so he's somebody that really intrigues me. He doesn't have the blocking upside. He's probably one of the lower tier tight end prospects as a blocker, and so that might scare teams away. Even though he played the majority of his snaps in line, he's not a move blocker, but he's also not a good inline blocker, and so that might scare teams away. But as a receiving prospect, I really like what he offers. He has a really high yards per catch relative to other positions. His ADA is pretty high. And so with Gillenberg, he's probably my favorite late round tight end prospect.
Okay, yeah, I mean,
He's somebody that I was telling you about. He had a visit with KC, and I would really like to see that kind of matchup.
yeah, I like the thought of that as well. I think overall, you look at the player comp and you see something like Dallas Goedert, who came from another smaller school. You kind of
Mhm.
get excited about that. You also look at Oscar Delp, who I think you're going to see a lot more people talk about during this process because he's from a big Power Five school. He's from Georgia. Georgia's competing for national titles year in and year out. Where Gillenborg is like, who's really going to talk about him outside of podcasts like this and maybe a few other deep dynasty people in the weeds? But out of Wyoming, how do you even try to like back test and research guys from smaller schools like this? Do you see any correlation between, hey, this guy dominated his size, his athleticism at a smaller school? Is that going to hold him back from NFL production in his rookie year or first couple seasons? Or is that any type of negative we should be worrying about here, or maybe even the opposite?
So, especially with tight end prospects, if they're coming from a small school, Wyoming is not necessarily that small of a school. I think the two guys that first come to mind is Harold Fannin and Tucker Kraft. I'm trying to remember where Tucker Kraft went.
I think South Dakota State.
Yeah. So those are like really like those are small schools, right? And so if a tight end prospect is coming from a small school, what I want to see is like I want them to dominate. Like I want them to put up like wide receiver one type of numbers. And we saw that with Harold Fannin, and we saw that with Tucker Kraft. And Tucker Kraft was like a phenomenal receiver and a phenomenal blocker. That's why the model rates him really high, despite having like lower draft capital and despite being the second tight end taken in his class. He was really good from an efficiency and productive standpoint, and also obviously Harold Fannin. With someone like John Michael Gillenberg, we don't have that kind of production profile. It's really all just upside. With Gillenberg, what I also like is that he's been hyper efficient. So when he's on the field, he's been productive, but his injury history is kind of keeping him back. I think from having maybe like a Tucker Kraft type of production profile. He's had injuries with like his ankle, his collarbone, his foot or leg. I don't remember all. I know there was an ankle injury and a collarbone injury, and he's missed a lot of time. But so I think he's one of the few prospects in a class that I think his injury history has really kept him from producing and being seen as like an actual higher end prospect. And so from an efficiency standpoint, that's why I like Gillenberg, but he doesn't have like the production profile at a small school that someone like Kraft or Fannin had.
Yeah, for sure. No, I'm definitely intrigued with him as a prospect for sure, and just the fact that you've got him at 5 in your prospect model over guys we're hearing pop up a lot in these discussions. We talked about Jolly, we talked about Koziol, Oscar Delp, Michael Trigg is the guy that pops up a lot as well. I guess speak now or forever hold your peace. Is there anyone worth mentioning that we have not brought up on this show?
The one guy that may never do anything is Rohan Jones. What's interesting about Rohan Jones is he's actually not coming from a small school. He's coming out of Arkansas. And so you have someone like Mike Washington on the same team, and he produced and he's getting a lot of hype. But someone like Rohan Jones is just really um, perplexing as far as like not getting any kind of hype. He has some of the most crazy numbers you're gonna see. Like if you pull up his profile and you take a quick look, you're gonna see it pretty quick. His yards per reception are absurd. It's 17 yards per reception for his career. This last year, he had over 500 yards on 20 receptions. If you watch his tape in Arkansas this past year, it's literally just big play after big play after big play. Like you have guys that are getting 50 receptions, not even breaking 500 yards in this class, and Rohan Jones did it off 20 receptions. And the thing with him, he also didn't necessarily run a lot of routes. My comp for him is like I was really high on Dante Thornton Jr. last year. I was higher than consensus on him just because of his big play ability. And Rohan Jones reminds me of like a Dante Thornton Jr. prospect at the tight end position without the athleticism. Rohan Jones is actually not that athletic at all. But for whatever reason, every year of his career, he's just been making plays after plays every single time he touched the ball, every single time he was on the field. And so
Right.
uh, I really like him, but with him, he's small. He's 6'3". I think he's sub 240. He's not a big tight end prospect. He's not getting any hype. He's low on the consensus board. And so if a team is looking into him and they maybe they're looking in like the 6th or 7th round, my concern with him is that teams don't want a like unathletic upside receiver prospect as their tight end three. They're gonna want like a inline blocker that can kind of be this like six offensive lineman. Those are the kind of tight ends that teams are investing in later rounds. And Rohan Jones doesn't fit that mold, and so that's kind of what scares me. There was somebody else last year, um, John Coyers, I think, something like that, who also had like a pretty good production profile in college, but then he went undrafted and didn't really do anything. And so,
Yeah, it's interesting because the routes, the targets, the reception, the actual raw numbers of production don't really scream out at you. But then you look at the drop rate, really good hands, right? Yards per reception, really high, number one in the class. Yards after the catch, A dot. Yards per route run, which is a metric that I really think is valuable here as well. You're looking at first in his class, so it's a very interesting prospect profile, as you mentioned. 6'3", 242, not the biggest size, but maybe the right type of scheme fit for the right landing spot. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting name, and it's interesting to see how your model differs from a lot of the consensus kind of group think right now. And I'll pull this up right now to show a quick example. And this is something that we'll be debuting in a little bit. Where we have our, let's see if you can see this here. We have our mockx.co, and this is what we've done the last couple of years with our big board and mock draft consensus tracker, to where we're pulling in big boards from across the industry, from Daniel Jeremiah, from Tankathon, from other top outlets. We're pulling in mock drafts from, hundreds of different analysts. But what we're also doing is we're scoring the most accurate mock drafters based off scoring awards from the last 5 years, whether it's the Huddle Report, Fantasy Pros, Walter Football, Mock Draft Database, etc. And when you look at the big board overall, you're able to compare these players. And I think what I'm seeing from your prospect model is that you really veer from the pack, which I like, because when you put together these composite models, as you're seeing here, you can really you really see a lot of group think. And what's the reason for actually putting this tight end fourth versus eighth or ninth? And people are going more off gut feel and group think than they are actually breaking down the data. And that's why I really like our discussions here, because you're thinking more outside the box than a lot of these big board rankers and mock drafters are doing. So again, really appreciate the conversation. If you want to follow Andres here, you can go to his Twitter, as you see on the screen, at @nofilm_analysis. Spoiler alert, Andres actually does watch a lot of film. It's part of his model as well. So pardon the shtick there. You can also go to his Patreon, which he has linked in his bio, on his Twitter as well, to get the full access to the updated tight end prospect model, the RB prospect model, the wide receiver prospect model. Andres is also doing daily write-ups for these player prospect breakdowns on his Twitter page as well. So make sure to subscribe to his Patreon. Make sure to check him out on Twitter. Andres, I've been trying to keep this going a little longer because I see the live stream viewer count keeps going up and up the more we get down on the board on all these random prospect names. But we said we were going to go short. I guess we didn't go as short as I thought. But
I mean, if you have any other people you want to talk about, like I'm always down. Like I feel like an infinite amount of stuff I can talk about.
It's Friday night, April 10th, 11 p.m. Eastern time, and we're sitting here talking dynasty tight ends. Still more than 2 weeks out from the draft, so obviously we love what we're doing, and we appreciate everyone listening, watching on the live stream as well. Let's throw one other guy. Like you talked about the guys down the board that you liked. Who's another guy you see, let's say in your top 10 where like maybe you don't like? You talk about how the prospect model isn't an exact science at the end of the day. You might personally disagree with what your prospect grade is showing. Who's one guy that you think could be a red flag that you maybe think could be overvalued in terms of what your model is showing right now?
The obvious answer is someone like Rohan Jones. Honestly, like he has probably the highest chance of going undrafted, and if he goes undrafted, then he just has like a ginormous uphill climb, right? He's also coming in. He's going to be 25 years old as a rookie, I think, and so he reminds me of, like I said, someone like Dante Thornton Jr., where I look in and I like a lot of the efficiency metrics. But knowing how the model works and how it doesn't, I'm still trying to improve the normalization of the data and how it weighs certain things. And sometimes efficiency metrics, especially for like these prospects that have like a low amount of total reps, but like really high yards per route run. He's someone that sticks out to me as like, if he goes undrafted, like he may not even play a snap in the NFL. And I have him as like a top 10 prospect. And there's going to be guys like Eli Raridan, who's going to go maybe the third or fourth round, and they're probably going to be better, right? And so he's somebody that, despite him ranking high, I'm not going to put like a lot of investment in. He's not going to be like a dynasty target unless he gets drafted higher than expected. And maybe someone to follow if he starts getting like reps for a team.
Yeah. And we're talking super deep dynasty formats too, right? And like, again, you're talking about the glass half full, glass half empty perspectives here from both sides of the spectrum. The two guys I see popping up the most, and I'll let you finish up with these guys here, Michael Trigg, and you mentioned Eli Raridan from Notre Dame. They seem to be the most common names popping up of like, hey, if you're going to give me a top 5, you're going to give me a half dozen guys. I see those guys consistently popping up. You have Michael Trigg 11th, you have Raridan 12th, so you're below both guys consensus wise compared to most big boards out there. Obviously very similar prospect scores, but a huge jump in terms of production score between Trigg. Raridan looks like he might be almost dead last in this class, or at least in the very bottom tier. What are your thoughts on those two guys, if you want to take both or just talk one of them?
Yeah, Raridan, he's probably one of the better inline blockers in the class. And so teams are going to value that. And he has the potential where he's a good enough receiver. He can be like a low tight end 1, high tight end 2, maybe like a Daniel Bellinger, someone like that, right? And so there's value there for a team. There's not necessarily value from a dynasty or fantasy perspective. And so Eli Raridan is somebody like, if I were to like manually change and tweak the rankings, I'd probably put him in the top 10. But again, he's just not somebody that I necessarily see that upside with. With Michael Trigg, he's somebody that, I don't know, I think he might have been injured, but pre-combine, people were saying he was like the most athletic tight end in the class. Right. And he comes out and just like completely bombs his testing. like really, really bad. And even his athletic score in here, I have him decent. And that's because his in-game athleticism is actually pretty good. But his measurables were just bad. I can look at him up, but like, and so he's somebody that I think tested worse than
Yeah.
I was expecting. But there's also some upside there as a receiver. I don't like that he had his best season this past year. He's going to be 24 as a rookie. He had his best season as 23. Age doesn't matter as much for tight ends. Like Tyler Warren had his best season as 22 at 22, and Trigg at least has had more playing time than what we saw with Warren. But also with Trigg, there's been like some off the field concerns, and so he's really just in a group of prospects where they're probably going to go maybe like fourth round, and teams are going to invest into that, but they're likely going to be like a tight end two for a team. And how
Yeah.
much do we value that? Um, I think the one name I want to bring up is actually the last ranked tight end
Okay.
prospect, and that's Max Bredesen. And he's somebody that I would take way higher. And
Okay.
it was the way this is what like kind of like the issues with the model is that Bredesen has had like no production at Michigan. But if we're gonna take a guy that has blocking upside, Bredesen is like by far the best blocking tight end. He's actually Michigan played him a lot at fullback. If you look at the consensus board, he like yeah, right here, he's listed as a running back. On the consensus board,
Okay.
he might be listed as a running back. He played more in line than fullback, but I
Right.
think with how people are projecting him, they're projecting him like you can see his size. He's 6'2", 250. He's really stocky. But I really, really like his upside as a blocker. Like I'm a
Okay.
Giants fan, and I wouldn't mind taking him in like we have 3 6 round picks, and I wouldn't mind taking him with one of them to be potential replacement. Um, who's the fullback we just got from Baltimore? For him, I think he has like upside as that second tight end, as a fullback, as a move tight end. And he even has some juice after the catch, which I like. Like he
Okay.
had 12 receptions in his career, and he forced four missed tackles. So that's good for like a 33% forced missed tackle rate. But even watching him, he had some juice after the catch, which is what makes me think there's maybe something there as a potential target from the fullback position. But so he's somebody that I really like. He's not going to be
Okay.
like a traditional tight end. He's probably going to be more of a fullback, but he's somebody that I would keep an eye on.
Yeah, when it's Friday night now at 11:09 p.m. Eastern time, and you're bringing up Max Bredesen, out of the love of the game, we know that Andres knows ball over here. I mean, I'm looking at like the last tight end on Tankathon's big board is teammate Marlon Klein, and he's the last tight end listed overall for them. And I see you have the comp Kyle Juszczyk. So that's an interesting one for sure. But I really like as we talk through everything, and you look at all the different measurables you're tracking. The top five to me actually really makes sense with Gillenborg, Endries, Claire, Sadiq, Stowers, and I don't think you're going to see that ranking 1 through 5 at a lot of different places. I would definitely, I think Jolly, Koziel have arguments to be in that range as well for possible upside there. But then I think we talked a lot about possible guys that are overvalued. Michael Trigg, you just mentioned, Oscar Delp, Sam Roush, that you might see, someone might see the height weight combo, someone might see the production profile and just, hey, this is a sleeper. And there's not really any real data backing that up. So, again, like, stay tuned to Andres' Twitter page. Um, and I'll pull that up again real quick for those who are watching at no film underscore analysis. Make sure to hit the link in his bio for his Patreon to get full access to everything he's doing for modeling for running backs, tight ends, wide receivers. You can check out the link here. I'm going to pop it up one more time on the screen on YouTube at Chris Dell Fantasy. You can catch all 3 episodes. We've done deep dives. I think we're at probably maybe 4 or 5 hours combined on all 3. We'll be doing a newsletter Dynasty mega preview before the draft. That's probably going to be launching a bit later this week. I'm kind of targeting next week, kind of targeting Thursday next week. It'll be officially 2 weeks out, a week out from the draft, excuse me. And then again, I'll have more information on our Mock X stock market NFL draft tracker, putting some new links into there. I've got a scraper set up that I built with Claude Code. I'm excited about adding the API for the sportsbook into that to truly track the most valuable signals and edges coming out of NFL draft prop betting. So make sure to stay tuned for more news on that. Andreas, again, man, really appreciate you coming on, especially on a Friday night. I think we should definitely get together at some point after the draft and do some type of a recap. We'll go over landing spots, draft capital, and how much that's changed things in your model. I know you're going to be meticulously updating your model over the next couple of months. The work is just getting started for you. Anything else that you're working on that you want to mention before we sign off here?
No, yeah, I really, really appreciate you having me on again. Like I said, I feel like I have an infinite amount of stuff that I can talk about with this. But what I'm really excited about is I'm working on a kind of like an analytical profile 2.0. And so it's going to be like a second page added to the original analytical profiles for wide receivers, tight ends, and running backs. And what that's going to look at, especially for the receiver prospects for tight ends and wide receivers, is one of the things I really like is showing the yardage, depth, and breadth breakdown. So it's going to show how the receivers gain the yards from between left, center, right parts of the field, short, intermediate, deep, the behind the line of scrimmage in the screen game. And another thing that I think is really cool is it's going to show you. So we have like the checklist grade for all these prospects, and you can see it's like the third to last column. And so what this new profile is going to show you is like the actual red flags. It's going to show you green, yellow, orange, and red. And it's going to be based off historical thresholds and metrics for each prospect and see. So if we're looking at like wide receivers, they're going to show us a green flag if they're above 3.0 yards per route run. It's going to show yellow if they're like in around 2.5, or orange if they're around 2, red if they're below. Like so that's kind of what it's going to show you for like 7-8 different metrics. So that's what I'm really excited for.
Oh, that's awesome, man. Yeah, diving deeper into it for sure is going to bring a lot of value. What are you actually doing during the regular season? Because I know you're not the biggest fantasy. I know you do play fantasy, but not the biggest fantasy player. And a lot of this is geared towards just overall prospect evaluation. What are your plans actually for once we get going in the fall? And what are you going to be more back testing data, researching upcoming prospects
that's when I'm working a lot on the model itself.
Okay.
And so that's when I'm like testing different things. I do a lot of deep dives into the different metrics. And also I'm building out like the actual profile. Like we see the view of the profile right now. That took me like 3-4 months. And a lot of times it was like during like the football season, I was just building these profiles out and testing a lot of different things. And so if I like how the profiles are now, then I'm going to kind of take the next step. And there's like a lot of different things I want to work on. Even the model itself, there's a lot of things that I like where it's at right now, but I know all the things it can be improved upon. It just takes time. And so, and I haven't really been able to during this draft season. And I really started looking to prospects back in like October this year is when I started diving into this class. But once the draft season is over, I'm probably going to go back and see what else I can improve upon in the model.
I actually just want to bring this up because we have the player cards on the NFL stock market tracker at mockx.co. And I would definitely like to talk once we get off here before our next show about adding some of your prospect data into these player cards that we have that show the movement in ADP based off mocks as we get closer to the draft. And I think the information is very valuable. I'm certainly going to be using Andres's model when it comes to my rookie rankings, my updated dynasty rankings, as a source that I rely on to really sift through the data and know what's noise and what's not. But anyways, really appreciate everybody tuning in tonight. You can catch our the podcast version, the audio version of this feed on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify. Make sure to leave a rating and review if you get a chance. I think we peaked at just under 700 live viewers here on a Friday night to just show all the people that are truly passionate about prospect modeling and also dynasty fantasy formats at the same time. So again, Andres, appreciate having you on for the third time, and look forward to having you on and continuing the conversation after the draft as well, man.